So as we conclude our study of Rome, it doesn't say Roman Empire, it says Byzantine Empire. But to conclude with Rome, we will examine the often forgotten about, not always focused on, Byzantine Empire. And the base of the Byzantine Empire was here, the city of Constantinople. And we see the extent of the Byzantine Empire at their height. So areas of Spain, North Africa, the Middle East, Turkey, Greece, and Rome. They didn't exactly succeed in their mission to reclaim the Mediterranean as a Roman lake, but they certainly came very close. Now, in looking at the Byzantines, the one ruler who comes to mind, the Emperor Justinian. All right, so modern historians distinguish Eastern Rome by calling them Byzantines, but they saw themselves as Romans because they carried on the traditions of imperial Rome for another 1,000 years. Another 1,000 years after the fall in the West, the Byzantines will carry on. Now, there were definite similarities between the two. Both halves featured educated elites who spoke Greek and Latin. They preserved and accepted Roman law, and nearly everyone was Christian. Now, again, it's Justinian the First who stands out amongst all Byzantines. The first thing that characterizes his reign was commissioning the Justinian Corpus of Civil Law, also referred to as Justinian's Code. It took almost 4 decades to compile, and it was compiled in the Latin language, which was still the official language of the Byzantines. Eventually it'll be Greek, but Latin was the official one. The actual code comprised over 2,000 volumes, and all 3 parts were meant to be interpreted as the supreme law, even though Justinian had to issue other laws. This codex formed the basis of Western legal tradition because it kept Roman law around. So Justinian commissioned a law code. He had to suppress a revolt. All right, he suppressed a revolt. He had to deal with an outbreak called the Nika Revolt. Now, watching races, so chariot races in the Hippodrome, which was attached to the imperial palace, was a favorite pastime of the Byzantines. Citizens supported different teams and would identify by their colors, like blues and greens. These also served as de facto political affiliations. Several members of the Blues and Greens were arrested for their role in a murder that was connected to a riot, and some of them escaped and took refuge in a church. Eventually, the mob turned their frustration on the emperor himself, shouting Nika, which is conquer or revolt. Now, Justinian was dissuaded from leaving the city by his wife, the Empress Theodora, and his decision to stay coincided with the return of his best general, Belisarius. Now, when we see brutal reaction, here's your brutal reaction. He lured each faction into the Hippodrome, having already struck a bargain with the Blues. So both sides, Blues and Greens, were let in. All of a sudden, the Blues left, and imperial troops stormed the Hippodrome, slaughtering 30,000 of the Greens. So when we say brutal, it was brutal. In return, to show his gratitude, he commissioned the building of the, well, at the time, church that you see on your screen, the Hagia Sophia, or the Church of the Holy Wisdom. It took 5 years to construct and became the center of the Greek Orthodox Church for nearly 1,000 years. The fast construction time was a record for this time frame, and its mighty dome that you see in the center was over 100 feet tall. It's as tall as Cinderella's castle is at Disney World, and it's 100 feet in diameter. Its 40 windows at the bottom gave the impression that it was floating on air, and it led observers to believe that it could only have been built with divine help. Now, after the Turks took over in 1453, it was quickly converted into a mosque, And that's when these tall columns, known as the minarets, were added. The minarets are consistent with Islamic architecture. It became a museum in 1935, and very recently, 2020, it actually reopened as a mosque. So the Greeks have the Parthenon, the Romans have the Colosseum, the Byzantines have the mighty Hagia Sophia as their lasting testament to their greatness, although the Hagia Sophia still has practical function. Now, disease is a constant threat throughout history, and similar to its effects in the Greek world, plague also struck the Byzantine world. The plague of Justinian began in the year 541 and actually struck the emperor himself. This is actually similar to the bubonic plague that struck the medieval world in the mid-1300s. One observer noted that it began in towns along the coast and then spread inland, but nobody knew why. So this is where we'll see that trade routes facilitate the exchange of goods, services, ideas, and disease. Scholars in the late 1800s made the connection between rats living on ships as the main carriers of the disease. All told, we see that about 25% of the emperor's subjects died. 19 million of the 26 million were left standing. So 7 million people died in this plague. This population decline led to a decreased urbanization in the empire. And it, of course, led to decreased tax revenues and a shrinking economy. So with Justinian, the legacies are a law code, how he brutally suppressed revolt, commissioned monumental architecture, and had to deal with the plague. Now, this is obviously more modern day, if you see the cruise ships in the background, but we get a great look at the domes of the Hagia Sophia and the minarets that characterize the Islamic architecture. The mighty columns on the inside, the Arabic that was commissioned under Islamic rule. We see the fusion of what was once Christian and is now Muslim with something like the Hagia Sophia. Now, the iconoclastic controversy demonstrates the fact that issues within Christianity will continue. When we last left off with Christianity, there was a controversy about who is Jesus? What is the substance of Jesus? Is he man and God, or is he man that is like God? The iconoclastic controversy was the main issue with the Byzantines. Technically speaking, the Byzantine Empire was the political ruler of the empire, and the Patriarch of Constantinople presided over the church. Now, the concept of icon worship using images was very divisive, and the iconoclasts referred to those who wanted the removal of all images from the church. They wanted images like what you see on your screen removed. However, they wanted to allow prayers to be directed only at the cross. This desire deeply divided the Christian faith. And when one Byzantine empire ordered the removal of an image of Jesus from the entrance to his palace, an angry mob of women killed the man who took it down. So again, we're talking images like you see here, a representation of the Trinity. Representation of the Trinity. The church went back and forth on the issue, at times outlawing them and then reinstating them. Eventually, the Eastern Church allowed them. The Eastern Church allowed icons, and many scholars feel that the real issue was the pressure that they faced from Muslims. And what we mean is the Islamic empires were pushing in from the east. And they were threatening Byzantine lands and famously did not allow any depictions of the Prophet Muhammad. So this was viewed as maybe the Byzantine Christian way of distinguishing themselves from their enemies. Now, one very interesting characteristic of the Byzantines is their invention of and use of a weapon known as Greek fire, which you see depicted on your screen. This was developed in the 670s, and it could float on water. I'll say that again. This was fire that could float on water. There are no accounts of it backfiring on Byzantine ships, and it saved them countless times from invaders. If you're familiar with Game of Thrones, when they used wildfire, which burned on the water, this was the clear inspiration for it. Greek fire, the use of this weapon, this early flamethrower, was a state secret that was kept under such lock and key that nobody knows the exact mixture. When the Byzantines fell, so too fell the secret of the Greek fire. Now, Constantinople itself remained Christian until 1453, although it was taken over by Western Crusaders during the Fourth Crusade for a time. The Ottoman Turks are the ones who eventually invaded. And they had actually paid tribute to the Byzantines, but they became so weak by the 1450s that the Turkish ruler, Mehmet the Conqueror, decided to invade and just end the charade. He positioned 3 massive cannon outside the city walls, along with 80,000 troops. 80,000. There were 8,000 Byzantines and their allies who did hold out for 53 days, but the end came quickly. And realistically, if the Turks wanted to invade and conquer, it probably would have took quicker than 53 days. But they didn't really have any issue in destroying the city. Rather than plunder, they simply conquered the city. Every church was converted to a mosque. And Constantinople became known as Istanbul, the name it holds today. And the most important city in Christendom had now fallen. Now, due to their connections to the Eastern Orthodox Church, the city of Moscow will take up the mantle of declaring themselves the heirs to the Romans and even fashion themselves as the Third Rome. But for all intents and purposes, Rome officially fell in the year 1453 with the invasion of the Turks and the collapse of the Byzantine Empire.